Okay, so in this video I'm going to cover modeling with this little 3D polyhedron that we made in the previous video. So the first thing is to open up the file where you saved your little polyhedron, and I'm going to go ahead and actually just delete the formwork from this one. And what I'm also going to do is then save this file as a new file. So I'll go save as, and I'll just call this one too. Okay, so what we want to do now is explore a couple of different ways to kind of populate populate like a three-dimensional form using this polyhedron. So what I'm going to do is just demonstrate a couple of quick ways that you can play with this polyhedron and make more complex configurations. And I'll just quickly change my layer. Okay. So the first way that you can kind of operate with this polyhedron is simply by copying it and by mirroring it. One thing that you'll find you can do with it, which is really simple, is just to do a kind of two-dimensional mirror operation. And if I just quickly mirror it into all different configurations, or into 4 different configurations, then I can quickly start to play with how this thing is arranged by moving it around and snapping it together. You can see that pretty quickly you'll start to get some kind of interesting configurations and stuff like that. So the idea is that you kind of keep the block in the same basic orientation, meaning the top and the bottom of the same surface. You just kind of rotate it around to make some different shapes and play with geometry. And you can see that even when this thing is moving at different angles, it kind of makes, kind of interesting intersections. It'll make, a kind of sheared grid from one side, and then this kind of rotating shape from the sides. So that's one way that you can kind of operate with this geometry, just by basically copying it on the square faces and rotating it to different orientations. The next kind of operation that you can do basically has to do with keeping it kind of in a single plane, but actually rotating it, or I'm sorry, actually mirroring it. So if I use the mirror command, I also have this option to choose a 3-point mirror. And because of the nature of this shape, if I start to mirror it, along any one of the faces, so again, I got to choose 3-point each time. I can start to make some pretty cool geometry. So again, you can see that the kind of basic form of this is to make one of these kind of 6-sided flowers. And you can then start to kind of copy it around based on those configurations. And kind of populate a surface using this form, using this kind of tile. And then, once you're done kind of playing with it in that direction, you could also kind of start to stack it in the other direction. And start to shift the blocks and so on. and create voids through it and stuff like that. So you could make a kind of interesting, tiling pattern, or three-dimensional kind of tiling pattern using this geometry. So that's the second method, which involves kind of mirroring it. But the third method, which basically starts in the same way, will allow you to kind of form complex rotations. So if I again use the mirror command, choose the option 3-point, okay, I can make the same kind of flower thing, but then I could also start to mirror it in other directions. So for example, if I made a form there, then I could start to make a petal that goes in another orientation. So if I go something like that, you can see that I can start to make kind of interlocking flowers like that one. And so those two flowers are kind of at a right angle to each other. But we can start to get them in all kinds of different angles, depending on which face of the original form we start to, move away from. And once you have these kind of six-sided elements, you can also start to move them in other directions. And create petals that are intersecting in either 2 or 3 blocks. Okay, so this is the kind of most complex version. But, based on kind of beginning with a simple set of rules, which you can define for yourself, like for example, keep the block, keep the top and the bottom of the block the same, and just copy it and rotate it, or move kind of all in one plane and keep everything rotated in one plane, or start to kind of operate three-dimensionally and find ways for these petals to intersect in other dimensions. Okay, and you can start to make cool configurations that way. So the point is basically just kind of test out a couple of different methods of making a kind of three-dimensional configuration of these blocks based on the rules of like kind of how they like to go together, and the ways you can kind of operate to cluster them and so on. And then in the next exercise, we're going to move towards creating a rendering with this kind of three-dimensional form. And that is it for this tutorial.